So this panel is sort of over neighbor relations and right to farm issues. So I'm going to get us started with Keith Olinger, who's a farmer in Howard County. And again, you have his bio in the packet, so you can go ahead and read it. And I'll let Keith turn it over to Keith and let Keith talk about his issues that he's faced as a farmer in Howard County and how he's dealt with those.
Well, thank you, Paul. I'll try not to blow out your ears. I have a pretty good booming voice, so I'll try to stay away from the microphone here. But so what had happened with us is a little bit of the backstory. Our family's been farming for as far back as we can trace into Germany, over 400 years. We came to Philadelphia in 1741 and settled in Berks County. I'm Pennsylvania Dutch. I jokingly say I'm the first export, so I came down to Maryland. In 1957, my grandfather was helping fill the fuel tanks at the farm, and he must have got some gas on his hands and rubbed it on his bib overalls, and when he started the tractor, a spark lit him on fire. And so he spent 6 months in the hospital with skin grafts and everything else. He got out on Halloween of '57. It was another 2 years before he became remotely functional as far as a farmer. My uncles were 10, 11, and my dad was 13. My Uncle Luke was 14. And then it was my grandmother were essentially running the farm. Well, then that spring, the barn caught fire, and my grandmother and grandfather were able to get the cows out of the barn, but when the fire trucks came, it scared the cows. They ran back into the burning barn, and we lost half the herd, burned to death. So at that time, insurance wasn't a full boat thing. You got a percentage, and so they decided, and they couldn't replace the building and the herd, so they went to the smart thing, replace the herd. Well, in the animals that they brought in, one or all of them had a disease called brucellosis, and what happened was the state quarantined the herd, so they couldn't buy any animals in, they couldn't sell any animals out, and so essentially you had a farm that didn't have an income for about 5 years. At the end of that 5-year term, the bank, they weren't making the mortgage payments. The bank was going to sheriff sale them, so they worked out a deal that if they did a quick sale, they wouldn't throw them off. And that's what they did, and that was the end of the Olinger family farm. So that was '61. I was born in '69, and my family had been working on other farms by that point. My dad was a dairy herdsman for 2 dairy herds. And so I grew up in the '70s, which was the get bigger, get out years, and farmers were expanding. And we had a deep love of farming in our community. Most of the people were retired farmers or relatives of farmers. It was a very, very integrated community. And so I had this deep love of farming. Well, then the '80s came. We had the first crisis, Farm Aid, the dairy buyout. You had Pennsylvania Dutch farmers that never throw anything away and never spend any money going bankrupt. And I loved farming. I absolutely adored it. I worked on all my neighbors' farms. And my advice, the family was like, don't even bother. It's not worth it. It's a dead industry. Don't even do it. And but that didn't matter. I still loved it. So I had to figure out, well, how am I going to make money and get a farm? So one of the skills or one of the interests that I had was I loved the ocean. We used to go to the Jersey Shore every year, and I just loved the ships and everything else. So I went back to college, got a degree in public policy, worked with Senate, worked with the House in the state of Pennsylvania. And then I went back to school to get my master's degree and get my ship's officer's license, so I worked as a ship's officer in the United States Merchant Marine. And that's how I made my money. You can make a good living as a sailor. So I met my wife, and we came down here. I worked for Military Sea Lift Command at the Navy Yard. And we kept looking and looking, and finally we said, all right, it's time we go and try and buy a farm. So we found a place in Montgomery County. It was in the Ag Reserve. The transfer development rights had been sold. So its primary use was agriculture. It was in their agricultural preservation program. The property was zoned for agriculture. My wife, myself, our realtor, we looked at the public record. Everything looked good. We hired a title company, did a title search. Nothing came back negative. So we bought the property. Now again, it was $945,000, bought you 10 acres in Montgomery County, so that's what I did. That was the best I could do. And about 2 years in, we finally got everything together. I started to put in a boundary fence because I was a livestock farmer. As I traveled around the world, I looked at all these best practices. I was looking more towards organic. I thought, I'm going to raise food, share it with these people in this community. I don't have to sell to the world, but I can make a good living selling to people in my neighborhood, build a community around it. And suddenly the neighbor came over and said, you can't put up a fence. What are you doing here? And I said, well, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. We did a title search, nothing came back. Well, we were going through, if you remember that time, 2009, the market was crashing, and so we bought just below the peak. And so we were refinancing, and I called up the attorney that was doing the refinance, and I said, hey, this neighbor just told me this. I said, what the heck's he talking about? He said, oh, well, let me look. He's like, oh, yeah, there's these covenants on your land. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, why didn't anyone tell me this? I did a title search. Why didn't anybody tell me this? We looked at the public record. Where was this information? Oh, well, we're not required to tell you if we find covenants, conditions, or restrictions. We're required to tell you if we find a lien on the property. So understand, it wasn't a homeowners association. It wasn't a co-op association. It wasn't a condo association. They were not required to provide us documentation on the covenants because they said they didn't have to. So suddenly, we had spent all this money on a piece of land to farm, and it became quickly apparent that we were going to have a problem doing it. Well, then the next thing came the letter from the attorney that they were going to sue us if we didn't cease and desist taking down our fence that we were putting up for a boundary fence. So I immediately tried to figure out what in the heck just happened. So I reached out to the county. I'm like, you guys bought this land into ag preservation. I'm like, what the hell did you buy? In the covenants, it says you can't put a fence in front of the front line of the house. Why did you buy something that said you can't have a fence up? And why would you not tell me about it? Well, we didn't have to. So earlier in the day, when I asked about the covenants, conditions, and restrictions to the group up here, I know Ann and Mouth, I have no issues with them. I just wanted to get you thinking about this, that this can happen. So we immediately got an attorney. We tried to figure out what could we do. So we looked at trying to do a bill that would make it that you could not put covenants on a piece of agriculturally preserved land that would restrict its agricultural use. So we did it we had the option of doing it as a statewide bill or a county-specific bill. We decided for logistical purposes to do it as a county-specific bill. So in that case, it goes through the delegation first. If it passes the delegation favorably, more than likely it'll pass the whole body favorably. Well, it passed the Senate unanimously, and the neighbors turned it into an issue where if this passes, homeowners associations will be defunct. Anyone can put a red door on their house, and no one will have any say over it. And so it failed in the House by 1 vote. And so what happened was now we had a piece of property that we couldn't put up a fence, so what was I going to do? Well, I had planted native wildflowers and grasses because what I was going to do was multi-species rotational grazing. We were going to plant tree crops. And anyway, we could have gone forward with the lawsuit. We would have had to sue the seller's real estate agent, because the realtor had sold other properties in the community and had provided those buyers with the covenants. They did not provide us with the covenants. We would have had to sue the settlement company. We would have had to sue the entire neighborhood, because there was a architectural control committee that had been in the neighborhood. However, it had gone defunct at least 15 years prior to us. There were other homes in the neighborhood that had full boundary fences, that had sheep, that had horses. It was only when they found that I was actually going to be doing full working agriculture, I was going to be an actual working farm, that they lost their minds. Keep in mind, we had lived there 2 years. We had had pigs the entire time, and they never smelled the pigs. They never even knew they had them until we told them that I have pigs and we're raising pigs, and then suddenly you're going to destroy our property values. You're going to ruin our neighborhood. It was really hard because they refused to let their children play with our children, their grandchildren. They wouldn't let them play with them. I was surrounded by people that hated my guts. They posted different things. They put different things in the newspaper about me, and these were people that had never even met me. So I decided the attorney said, I think we can win this case. If we spent $60,000 on that up to that point. If we spent another $120,000, we could win the right to farm our property because they felt the covenants had been abandoned. But at this point, I did not want to live in that neighborhood anymore. I had to go outside and work right across the fence line from these people. No pun intended. We didn't have a fence anymore at that time. But I had to see them every day. They would look away from me. People would stop and take pictures. They'd sit up in the hill behind our house taking pictures of our property whenever I was out working. So it was a hostile situation. And so we decided to leave. But, again, we had our easement on the property did not require a soil and water conservation plan. We had voluntarily put one on. We were so small, we did not meet the criteria at that point for a nutrient management plan, but we had a nutrient management plan. I've been around farming my entire life, but I did the beginner farmer training program in Montgomery County with Chuck Schuster and the University of Maryland Extension. So it wasn't like I was getting into something that I didn't know. They said, oh, you knew, you just want to hide it now and do this. They said, oh, you don't want to farm, you just want to pretend to be a farmer. Well, anyone that knows me now comes out to the place, I'm a farmer, I'm sorry. So it was a very difficult situation. I did 2 years of therapy just to, work through it. My therapist would say, Keith, I think you're depressed. I said, I'm not depressed, I'm pissed and angry, but I ain't depressed. And she's like, no, I think you are. I'm like, trust me, I'm not, So just so you understand, it's a sad thing. We moved to Howard County, which is marginally not better as far as neighbor relations go. But we had to stay within the realm that my wife could drive back and forth to Bethesda, and God bless her heart, she drives about an hour and a half each day back and forth, each way. But I got a good wife. She's wonderful. We have a good, strong marriage. We've got great kids. They're smart. They're healthy. So it's not a bad story, but what it taught me was I had to be involved. So I'm on, I think, 14 different boards, committees, commissions, and councils. I love agriculture, and I'm never going to stop fighting for our farmers. I can't say where I'll be in 10 years because it's hard. The small farm is hard to run, but I definitely believe in the industry. I think it's a noble industry. There's good people here. So that's my experience with what happened.
Our next presenter is Meha Suri, who is a faculty specialist in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics with the University of Maryland and works on the Ag Law Education Initiative as well. So Meha, talk to us about the program we did this year.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here and staying late. And thank you, Keith, for sharing your story with us today. What we wanted to do with this panel as we're closing the conference today, I know that we're the Ag Law and Environmental Law Conference, but with this panel, I really wanted to highlight, of course, the legal protections that do exist, but as we heard with Keith's story, sometimes those protections aren't enough. And so the Ag Law Initiative is actually taking some efforts to educate different stakeholders in different communities so that we can avoid kind of these horrendous conflicts that, for example, that Keith's family was involved in. Okay, so just a bit of a background on the concept of neighbor relations and right to farm. So as we all know in Maryland and really across the country, that we have a trend basically, right, of suburban and urban areas are expanding, and that means that people who aren't used to being next to farms are now suddenly moving in next door to dairy, grain operations, et cetera. And unfortunately, as we heard, this can cause conflict, right? So there's legal conflicts that come up, but as Keith shared, there's also personal and social conflicts that also arise. Legal protections exist, like the right to farm law, but like in Keith's case and in some others, because the right to farm law is focused around nuisance suits, it's not always it's not always a defense that's possible. It can't always be utilized. For that reason, things like education and good communication are really important in preventing those conflicts. So having these non-legal or, well, not illegal, but non-legal and non-adversarial methods to establish good neighbor relationships. So right to farm in Maryland, as I've mentioned, and as I know many of you in the audience are aware, what is a law that was passed in 1981. It was updated a few years ago to include seafood and watermen, so it's not just agriculture on land. And basically the right to farm law exists, and what it does is protect farmers against nuisance lawsuits. So some things that are very typical on a farm operation, like odor, dust, noise, for a non-farming neighbor, that might could be considered a nuisance, or they may feel like that's a nuisance. And a legal approach that was taken around the time that this law was passed is that these groups or these homeowner associations would use these kind of nuisance suits to either kick out the farm or reduce their functionality to a point where it was basically no longer a working farm. So that was the goal behind these right to farm laws. It's an affirmative defense, and as long as the defendant can basically prove that they're using a good agricultural practice or seafood practice, more or less the right to farm law would protect them. So in Maryland, I'm not going to go through this, but these are some of the conditions that are required to be in place in the operation for right to farm to apply. It has to be a farm. It has to be in operation for a certain amount of time, and again, be in compliance with, relevant and applicable laws, regulations, and permits. So all 50 states in the U.S. have some version of right to farm. As we heard earlier, like in North Carolina, in the North Carolina hog case, and I think in Delaware as well, it has to be that there's a change in the land use around the farm as opposed to the farm changing for the law to kick in. But overall, all of the states have some right to farm protections. And in some of the states, there are constitutional amendments that include a right to farm protection. And in some states, those constitutional amendments have failed. So we talked about the hog farm litigation, so I won't get into it again. But basically, as we heard, that the suit was brought against Integrator, but what that led to the farms themselves being shut down. And Colby brought up this really great point earlier that some of the neighbors didn't realize what they were getting into with shutting down their neighbors' farms. And I think that that question and that topic is exactly why things like education and communication and establishing good neighbor relationships, understanding what these laws mean, what they protect and what they don't protect, what the consequences may be, I think that's why that component and some of the work that ALEI with our partners has done, I think that's why it's so important. Because the consequences, as Keith mentioned, and as we know from the hog farm litigation, the consequences can really be, the loss of a farm. So in Maryland, the counties have also adopted, almost all of the counties have adopted some version of a right to farm ordinance in their county codes. So basically they differ state by state, but the goal here is one of the goals in having it in the county code is that someone who's buying a property or moving into a neighborhood could be or should be put on notice that the right to farm law exists, and that to expect this as someone moving into a property in a new neighborhood, that this might be happening around you. And I don't have information on it today, but a few years ago, Paul and some others in the ALEI group actually did do some educational programming with realtor groups in particular, because realtors themselves may not understand what right to farm means. They may not understand what the easement or the sale of rights, of development rights actually means in the property that they're selling, that they're brokering. And so the goal of those workshops was to educate that service provider on what is it that you're actually telling these people. Like, what does this housing contract actually mean when it says that there's a right to farm in this neighborhood? So here are some exclusions to the right to farm defense. As I mentioned, you have to be a farmer or a seafood operator that's basically in good legal standing. People who are violating other laws are still liable to be held accountable for those violations. But again, something important to note is that the right to farm defense primarily is applied to farming operations. So if someone then also has like an outdoor concert business with a lot of traffic and a lot of noise, and they're not zoned to be doing that, that would not necessarily fall under the protection of the right to farm, but the farming operation would be what is protected. So something that's really not unique to Maryland, but I think really an important clause in the Maryland right to farm law is that before a lawsuit can be brought, the right to farm complaint has to be heard by a county ag reconciliation board or through the state's ag conflict resolution service, which is housed at the Maryland Department of Agriculture. So the local review or mediation helps to control legal costs and also can help both parties or the multiple parties involved understand, really get at the root of what the problem is. Often it's a miscommunication, often it's due to lack of education, lack of understanding. And although mediation is not a perfect solution, and of course mediation often and can fail, there's an opportunity to talk about these problems and come up with solutions outside of the courtroom when things can tend to get adversarial and heated and can of course be expensive and lengthy. And if the suit is not mediated or heard by a county board, then there isn't jurisdiction to actually hear the case. So our invited speaker today, who is not able to join us because he's busy in his fields today, was Lee Richardson, who's actually part of a county ag reconciliation board. Each county has one. Sometimes they're called different things or they're housed in different places, but they're made up of, a few to several individuals who have some expertise in ag and land use. And the boards meet basically whenever a complaint is brought. And so for some boards they meet a few times a year. And I know from some colleagues that they're on a board and they've never actually met once. So it really depends on the needs in the county. It depends on how these conflicts go, how much they escalate. But I did want to get a quote from Lee, who could not join us today, about his perception of being on the county board. So I won't read the quote to you because it is up here, but because basically the benefits are that we may avoid court, it can save money, and that often there's a misunderstanding and that a solution can be implemented quickly and effectively without getting into this process. I know that in some meetings it's as simple as, hey, a neighbor comes in and says, I don't like when you apply this so close to, I'm having an outdoor party. Can you wait till the next month to apply it? Answer, sure, and then it's over. And then we never went to court and there was no protracted battle. That, of course, it doesn't always go that way, and some of these conflicts do go to court. But having this institutional step in place, I think, is a really powerful tool. Oh.
Sorry, that's my timer.
Is a really powerful tool in the Maryland Right to Farm law. Okay, so I want to spend my last few minutes on the Neighbor Relations Project that ALEI is doing with the University of Maryland College of Agricultural and Natural Resources, the Departments of Resource Economics, Plant Sciences, and with our Extension colleagues. So, looks like we're a little cut off here, sorry. So these neighbor relations workshops are a series of workshops that were made possible in part by a grant from the Maryland Grain Producers Utilization Board, so thank you to our sponsors. And our goal basically was to develop this Ag 101 series to reach non-farming communities in rural areas. So like I said, it's like a Ag 101 over the course of about 2 hours or 3 hours. Our target audience was county officials and like zoning folks, planning folks, others who are very integral to the rural community, but may not have a good sense of what good agricultural practices are or even what agriculture is. So that day we had presentations on an intro to grain production, an intro to poultry production, water use, and what Right to Farm is and what it may entail for rural communities. So our goal here was to make that non-farming audience more aware of agriculture, to hopefully make it less scary and more familiar, and so that neighbors who aren't part of farm operations feel comfortable with what's going on, across on the other side of the fence. So we did a quiz, before and after with our attendees to see, how much they knew about ag going in and how much they learned coming out. And we had some pretty good numbers. We had increased knowledge on nutrient application, increased knowledge on aerial application. About more than half of the attendees increased their knowledge about tillage. And something actually that I think more than these metrics is important is we had conversations in the room. People by the end of the day, we're feeling comfortable enough to just ask questions that, because they didn't take crop science in high school or in college, so they could ask, what is coming out of those crop dusters, or actually, what does that smell when I drive on this road? Should I be worried about that? Is it bad for my health? And often those questions can easily turn into an adversarial conversation or a conflict-driven conversation, but because we had established that we were coming at this from an educational perspective, that we were coming at this with an open mind, I think we had a productive and educational conversation for those involved. I did want to thank my colleagues who are listed here, both for their ideas in putting together these workshops and making them possible. So some of the resources that the Ag Law Education Initiative has include a guide on the right to farm law, which is available on our website and has been mentioned a couple times today already. We are participants in a blog called the Extension Risk Management blog. We have several blog posts and will continue to post about right to farm as the issues come up, including things like how right to farm affects the production of different crops, the North Carolina case, and right to farm constitutional amendments. Thank you.
And our final speaker today is James Fisher from DPI to talk a little bit about what the poultry industry is doing with good neighbor relations.
Thank you. Happy to be here. So Delmarva Poultry Industry, what I'm with is a trade organization. We have about 1,700 members around Delmarva. About 1,000 of those members are farmers raising chickens. And one service that we provide those members is helping to make them aware of practices and things they can do on their farms, both to make them more profitable and to help them have better neighbor relations. That's been a consistent theme for many decades for farmers, is trying to limit the number of complaints they have from neighbors about their operations, and that's more and more as I mentioned, that when developments are moving closer and closer to areas that previously were solely agricultural. So one significant tool that we suggest to farmers and to our members is a fancy name for a simple thing: vegetative environmental buffers. And this is what we mean by that in a chicken farm context is simply a living fence, can be evergreen trees, shrubs, or sort of tall, warm season grasses that are either on the property line or sort of around a chicken house to surround the chicken house, even kind of pretty closely. We have been sort of really focused on this since about 2000. That was a time when the standards of chicken houses were changing. The past practices had been to kind of have passive ventilation. You would have a sort of a mesh sidewall for part of the chicken house. If it was hot, you would take away a panel to let air move through. If it was cold, you put the panel back in to preserve warmth. That changed to the industry standard today of tunnel ventilation, where you actively had fans pulling air in on one side and pushing it out the other. That had a lot of benefits for animal welfare. I mean, it was adopted for good reason. Gave farmers a lot more control over temperature, humidity, and ammonia. But it also involved sort of actively pushing air from inside a chicken house out. And sometimes when those fans were pointed at neighbors' property lines, or if they weren't, it started to become more apparent to neighbors that there was a chicken farm over there. And so that made life more complicated for some of them and for some of our members. So when we first started experimenting and helping farmers experiment with vegetative buffers, our goal at first was simply to prevent, dust and odor from crossing the property line and bothering neighbors. But as we had, dozens and then hundreds of farms experiment with this, we found some kind of surprising second-order benefits that made it easier for us to try to go out and pitch to growers, maybe you should try this. So we found not only did a buffer, when installed correctly, block dust and odor, it also blocked noise. It made it harder for neighbors to hear machinery or the tunnel fans running, and that was a good benefit. We also found that simply visually screening a farm from neighboring roads or neighboring properties, that probably had a good effect of lowering complaints. A lot of farmers will tell you that people around their farms smell with their eyes. We had more than one farmer say, I just built the chicken house, I just put the finishing touches on it. It's never had a bird in it, and I'm already getting complaints about the smell. So we said, well, if you're screening your house from your neighbors, they're a little less likely to do that. We also found that buffers could actually provide energy savings, monetary savings for the growers. If you have a buffer that's shading the area where your tunnel fans are, it's cooling the air that is being drawn into the house. And in the summer, that saves money on your utility bill. If you have a buffer that's planted in a way that acts as a windbreak to keep strong winds from reaching the sidewalls of your house, you're saving energy costs in the winter. So while that wasn't a good neighbor part of those buffers, but it did make it an easier sell for us to go around and convince growers to try them. Because then we were able to say to them, this isn't just a touchy-feely thing you're doing, this may actually save you money. We also noticed, and observed that a buffer's roots could improve water quality in the soil around the house. And I want to point out, these buffers are generally not part of the farm's nutrient management plan. The tools in an NMP, are and remain the manure storage shed to keep rainwater off of manure, and soil testing to make sure you don't apply litter on a field that already has enough nutrients. So we're not presenting these buffers as part of that NMP, but they, because you can have, dozens or hundreds of rooted plants in the soil where there weren't any before, you can be uptaking nutrients that happen to be there, whether there's a chicken farm there or not. So for 10 years now, we've had a DPI employee, Jim Passwaters, whose sole job is to visit farms, talk with farmers, and sort of explain to them, what a buffer is, if they're interested in it, how they might, maybe can go obtain cost share funding to help support it. We can help, Jim through DPI can help with the installation of the buffers, and we can kind of look out for their interests as more and more chicken companies and local governments start to adopt buffers in their chicken farm regulations. There are counties on Delmarva that, for new construction, now actually require a vegetative buffer to be installed. So in recent years, we've gotten involved to make sure that the expectations for that buffer's size at the moment of installation, the moment the farm gets up and running, are realistic. We had a locality on Virginia's Eastern Shore where a farmer, knew that was a requirement to have buffers. So he went to have a site plan written. The site planner wasn't too familiar with these farms, and he included in the site plan filed with the county, very mature trees, hundreds of mature trees. So the county's relying on, okay, in order to have this farm operate, you need to have 10-foot tall trees in, and that's, thousands and thousands of dollars. So we want to try to make sure that governments haven't, when they're expecting these buffers, they understand it's much more realistic to have them start small and grow big. That's more cost effective for the farmer, and it makes it more likely that those buffers will last. So what does the future of buffers look like? So we are experimenting more and more with pollinator-friendly buffers on farms. So adding into the mix wildflowers or other plants that attract pollinators. Obviously, that'll have a benefit for all the other parts of ag that need pollination to happen. It saves growers time and money by eliminating spaces on their farm they would otherwise have to mow for grass. If you don't have to go out and get on the mower every 2 weeks and tackle your grass patch, if you plant it as a pollinator-friendly buffer and tackle it twice a year, then that's saving you time and money. We're also helping growers sort of experiment with buffers around stormwater management ponds on their farms. Newer farms tend to be following, local regulations that require stormwater management features that older farms weren't required to have, and ponds are often a feature of that. So we're very interested in seeing what works for buffer plants around those ponds. The catch and the complication is we don't want to inadvertently create habitat for wildfowl that may want to see that as a rest stop, because that creates an avian influenza risk for the farmer. Wildfowl, ducks, and geese can be carriers of AI, and we definitely don't want to encourage them to spend any more time on a chicken farm than they already might want to do. So that it is an area where the farmer's interest and the neighbor interest and the water quality interest, we have to do a balance there. But overall, DPI is really committed to promoting and helping farmers install these. We absolutely think they make for better neighbor relations. Jim has visited 70 farms this year to help them work with that. He's been in phone conversations with even more farmers than that. We think they offer concrete benefits for farmers, and they help smooth out, and avoid tensions where they otherwise might be. So we're committed to doing it, and we're happy to talk to anybody who will listen about why farmers might want to do that and how they can go about it. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. Who has questions? I see Kate and a hand in the back. I don't know my mic.
Your mic's on.
Thanks, and this is for the folks affiliated with University of Maryland. We heard this morning about some of the activities by these taxpayer-funded legal clinics for wannabe gardeners in urban areas of the state. I'm interested in learning what kind of free legal resources are available to farmers that are taxpayer-funded, like these legal clinics, to assist them when they're facing a right-to-farm issue.
So some of the resources that are available include the resources that I listed here and more. So the Agricultural Law Education Initiative, our main mission is to provide free or free or almost free resources to Maryland farmers to navigate not just right-to-farm issues, but the variety of legal issues that farmers face in all aspects of their business. All of our resources are available online. They're free. They are mostly taxpayer funded. And we have a hotline. We do a lot of workshops and make ourselves available to farmers whenever a conflict may arise, including education before that may happen, and the ability to ask questions about personal situations.
So specifically, these legal clinics and environmental law and small businesses, are they going to represent a farmer who is facing a right to farm issue?
We're not going to comment on who the clinics are going to represent. Is there any other questions on this topic?
Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is for Mr. Fisher. You talked about smell a lot. So smell is often associated with particulate matter in the air. Can you just kind of talk about like air quality monitoring a little bit?
Yeah, so we know there's research from southern universities. I think the University of Georgia has taken a look at what buffers can do to prevent particles that are on a chicken farm from leaving the farm. I don't have the numbers, the exact numbers in my head, but they've documented that when you have a farm with no buffer versus a farm with a buffer, and you stand 300 or 500 or 1,000 feet away, there's measurable difference. You get lower amount of particles and ammonia at those distances when a buffer is in place.
And I'll just chime in a little bit. In our case, so what we do is we use mainly woody biomass, but carbonaceous material, so straw, used horse bedding that, it still has a lot of life as far as carbon, but they're cleaning it out of the horse stalls. And we mix it together, and then we use it to deep bed our pigs. And so what happens is the ammonia and nitrogen is soaked in by that carbon, so it doesn't it doesn't create the smell that you would have on, say, concrete. And so that's one of the reasons why the neighbors never even knew we had pigs, because, well, there was no smell. So.
We have time for one more question.
Any more questions? All right, well, help me thank our panelists.
So thanks, everyone. We're going to have the Dean of the University of Maryland College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, Dean Craig Beiruti, and give our closing remarks. But before he gets up here, I noticed that the link in the program to our conference materials was not working. So if you go to our website, umaglaw.org, we do have a conference section, so all of the slides from today will be available online, and I do apologize for that error. So Dean Beiruti.
Great, thank you. My name is Craig Beiruti. I'm Dean of the College of Ag and Natural Resources, and along with my other two Dean colleagues, I certainly want to thank you all for being here today. I got in here late, had some meetings over on campus that got me here a little bit late, so I was able to actually hear a little bit of the talks right before the lunch period, but I was absolutely overwhelmed by the number of people that were here today. I mean, I was talking to Paul, this is the largest number that they've had over the last several years that they've actually done this, and I think it's going to continue to grow as more and more people learn about ALEI and what they can actually provide along those lines. First of all, and I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things. One is give the speakers a round of applause. They were absolutely well prepared, very, very good. Topics were right on target, absolutely outstanding. The other thing is I'd like you to give the working group, our attorneys, a round of applause as well. That's the working group. They put all this together. What's really exciting about this is that it really brings three different universities together: University of Maryland Eastern Shore, University of Maryland Baltimore, University of Maryland College Park. You don't find anything like this anywhere else in the United States. This is a real treasure. Having a group of individuals that really know and understand kind of the legal environment that we all work within, and you deal with this on a day-to-day basis, is truly outstanding, and it's a treasure that we have here at the University of Maryland. It's a treasure that we have along the Delmarva Peninsula as well. I came from a university over at Colorado before coming here, and believe me, the legal issues that we dealt with, and we had no idea how to give advice about these legal issues to individuals that really were dealing with air quality, for instance, and water quality issues. And water lawyers, I mean, their water is like whiskey, right? You fight over it, you don't drink it, and it's a real problem. And here, it's absolutely spectacular. So again, thank you, our working group, for putting this together. Maryland has, and I'll parrot a little bit about what Suzanne Dorsey had alluded to early on. Maryland really leads the United States, certainly in diversity of agriculture, but also in terms of agriculture in relationship to the environment. And we're always thinking about the environment, and really the reason for that is because we've got the Chesapeake Bay, and it's always in our back pocket. We're always thinking about that. Air quality, we've got urbanization here. We probably lead the nation in terms of urban agriculture and all aspects dealing with the urban food system. We lead the nation in terms of water quality and water quality issues as well. We also lead the nation in terms of farmers and producers that have a tremendous amount of savvy with regards to not only producing, hopefully in an economic sort of way, and that's really what we're trying to help farmers do, but do it in a way that's also environmentally sustainable as well. And that's not an easy thing to do. And Maryland, I think, certainly leads the nation in terms of how to do this in a very positive sort of way. But there are all sorts of landmines associated with that as well. And many of those landmines were brought up today. And this is why I think the ALEI is so important to be able to address some of these landmines. Now, keep in mind also, ALEI stands for Ag Law Education Initiative. It is not Ag Law Advice or Advisory Initiative. They are not lawyers that you can go to and seek advice from. They are lawyers or attorneys that know and understand the environment in which we work and can be able to provide you what the rules and regulations are and the policies and those kinds of things. And they're very, very well versed in that as well. And so you have an outstanding group of individuals here that can provide that information. Upcoming topics, I know that they're going to be working on issues of food safety, for instance, hemp and the issues all around hemp and hemp growing is a big area as well, and certainly on farm succession. And so keep those topics in mind as well. Be thinking about other programs that you can participate in that they're going to be presenting throughout the year. In addition to that, their website, I think, is an outstanding website. Provides to you a whole host of written information. There are videos that they have put together as well. They also lead the nation in terms of taking leadership on some of the law-related journals. I mean, these are experts that are highly regarded throughout the nation. So on behalf of the University of Maryland, collectively, on behalf of Extension and on behalf of ALEI, thank you all for being here. I hope that this was very beneficial for you. We're going to continue to do this in future years. Thank you.